Dearest listeners, there exists in this world a peculiar truth that even the most intelligent among us often fail to recognize until it is far too late. The very thing we resist most fiercely is often precisely what our hearts require. If you believe the heart holds secrets even reason cannot grasp, please show your support by liking this video and subscribing for more tales of principle and passion. Today, your humble chronicler brings you the most extraordinary tale of a young woman who believed herself above the matrimonial fray, only to discover that love recognizes no such immunity. But let us not rush, for the best stories, like the finest port, must be savored properly. The dark eyes of Lady Genevieve Sinclair held an intelligence so vivid that matrons regarded her with suspicion and suitors withdrew swiftly. At 22, she had achieved what most young ladies of the ton considered impossible. She had successfully avoided matrimony for 3 full seasons, whilst maintaining her position in society through sheer force of maternal protection and familial consequence. Her late father, the Viscount Waverley, had left behind a considerable fortune and an even more considerable reputation for eccentricity, traits which his only daughter had inherited in equal measure, including a first edition of Locke's Treatises, which Genevieve kept upon her desk, more prized than any jewel. The Sinclair townhouse in Berkeley Square stood as testament to refined taste and substantial wealth. Its drawing room, decorated in shades of cream and gold, hosted morning callers with predictable regularity each season. Yet it was not in this elegant space that one would typically find Genevieve during the fashionable hours. More often than not, she could be discovered in her father's former study, surrounded by volumes of philosophy and natural science that would have scandalized any proper young lady's mamma. The Viscountess Viuva de Waverley, Genevieve's mother, had long since resigned herself to her daughter's peculiarities. A handsome woman of 45, she possessed sufficient social consequence to weather the whispers that inevitably followed her unconventional offspring. Yet even maternal devotion had its limits, and the beginning of the 1813 season had brought renewed determination to see Genevieve settled, if not happily, then at least respectably. It was on a particularly fine April morning that matters came to their inevitable crisis. The breakfast room overlooked the square's garden, where early spring flowers bloomed with optimistic abandon. Genevieve sat at the mahogany table, a copy of Mary Wollstonecraft's work carefully concealed beneath the morning's correspondence. Her mother, resplendent in a morning gown of lavender silk, poured tea with the sort of deliberate precision that presaged difficult conversation. The Viscountess began with seemingly innocuous remarks about the weather, the quality of the season's roses, and Lady Dalrymple's upcoming musical. Genevieve, well versed in her mother's tactics, waited for the true assault with patience born of experience. It came as expected, disguised as maternal concern. The previous evening's assembly at Lady Hartwell's had been, by all accounts, a crush. Every eligible gentleman in London had attended, along with their equally eligible sisters, cousins, and carefully chaperoned charges. Whilst the violin clamored in the ballroom, Genevieve sought refuge in the library, the scent of aged vellum and candle wax displacing the perfume of sweat and lilac. She did not converse with the volumes. She devoured a first edition of Samuel Johnson's dictionary that proved infinitely more engaging than the dancing. Her absence from the ballroom had not gone unnoticed. 3 gentlemen had specifically requested introductions, only to be informed that Lady Genevieve was indisposed. The Viscountess listed each suitor with admirable restraint. Sir Edmund Thorpe, possessed of 10,000 a year and an estate in Hertfordshire, the Honourable Mr. James Fitzwilliam, second son of the Earl of Richfield, and Lord Nathaniel Aldridge, heir to a considerable manufacturing fortune despite his family's unfortunate origins in trade. Genevieve listened with the expression of one enduring a particularly tedious sermon. When her mother concluded with an observation about opportunities that, once lost, could not be reclaimed, she set down her teacup with careful precision. She spoke then of marriage as she understood it, a legal arrangement whereby a woman surrendered all autonomy, property, and personhood to a man who might treat her well or ill according to his whim. She referenced Blackstone's commentaries, which her father had kept in his study, wherein the law clearly stated that husband and wife were one person, and that person was the husband. She noted that whilst gentlemen might pursue knowledge, art, and politics, wives were relegated to managing households and producing heirs. The Viscountess listened with the expression of one who had heard these arguments before. When Genevieve paused for breath, her mother responded with observations of her own. She spoke of the reality that unmarried women faced, the diminishing of consequence with age, the awkwardness of one's position in a society built upon family units, the eventual loneliness when friends married and mothers died. She reminded her daughter that for all her intelligence, she was not immune to the structures of the world in which they lived, and recalled the bitter dependency of her own early widowhood, a period she was determined her daughter should avoid. The conversation concluded, as such conversations inevitably must, with neither party convinced and both somewhat exhausted. Genevieve retreated to her chamber, where her lady's maid helped her dress for the day's engagements. The gown selected was of sprigged muslin, properly high-waisted and modest, with long sleeves that covered her arms to the wrist. Her dark hair, which fell in natural waves when unbound, was arranged in a simple style that required no false curls or fashionable excess. By 10:30, Genevieve found herself in the barouche beside her mother, bound for morning calls that she anticipated with all the enthusiasm of one facing the tooth drawer. The spring air carried the scent of coal smoke and horse dung, the perfume of London that no amount of flower sellers could quite disguise. They proceeded first to Lady Montrose's residence in Grosvenor Square, where the conversation centered upon Princess Charlotte's recent engagement and the shocking price of Harry's Mechlin lace. The second call, to Mrs. Arabella Worthing in Cavendish Square, proved equally tedious. Mrs. Worthing, a widow of indeterminate years and substantial fortune, had made herself arbiter of all things fashionable. Her drawing room contained no fewer than 7 young ladies, all in various stages of matrimonial pursuit, who discussed suitors with the strategic intensity of generals planning military campaigns. Miss Lavinia Hartley, a pretty blonde of 19 with more fortune than sense, held court on the subject of Lord Riverton's new phaeton. Miss Dorothy Kendrick, possessed of a magnificent soprano voice and very little else, lamented the scarcity of suitable tenor partners for the upcoming Venetian breakfast. The Honourable Miss Felicity Danvers, daughter of Baron Danvers and a particular friend since childhood, caught Genevieve's eye with an expression of shared suffering. When the conversation turned inevitably to the season's most eligible bachelors, Genevieve excused herself on pretense of admiring Mrs. Worthing's collection of hothouse flowers. She found herself instead in a small morning room, examining a rather fine watercolor of the Lake District when Felicity joined her. Felicity spoke in lowered tones of her own upcoming engagement to Captain Harcourt, a naval officer who had recently returned from the West Indies with both his health and fortune intact. She acknowledged that Genevieve disapproved of marriage on principle, but suggested gently that perhaps disapproval stemmed partly from never having met a gentleman worthy of consideration. After all, Felicity reasoned, surely not all men were tyrants, and not all marriages prisons. Genevieve responded with arguments well rehearsed, that even the kindest husband possessed absolute legal authority over his wife, that affection could fade whilst legal bonds remained, that intelligence and ambition in women were discouraged precisely because they threatened male supremacy. She recounted a recent case discussed amongst her father's barristers, where a widow had been left destitute, her property seized by a cousin under the strictures of coverture, adding cold, legal certainty to her arguments. She spoke with passion about the injustice of a system that gave women no recourse, no independence, no voice in the laws that governed them. Felicity listened with sympathy, but remained unconvinced. She suggested that perhaps Genevieve's father, who by all accounts had been an extraordinary man, had raised expectations impossible for ordinary gentlemen to meet. Before Genevieve could respond, Mrs. Worthing's butler announced that the carriages were ready and the morning's social obligations resumed their inexorable course. The third call nearly proved fatal to Genevieve's composure. Lady Summersby, a distant relation on her mother's side, received them in a drawing room so over-decorated it resembled a curiosity shop more than a residence. Every surface held some ornament, every wall bore multiple paintings, and the general effect was one of magnificent chaos. Lady Summersby, a formidable woman with iron-gray hair and opinions to match, spoke bluntly about Genevieve's matrimonial prospects. At 22, she was no longer in the first bloom of youth. Her reputation for intellectualism preceded her, and whilst some men might tolerate cleverness, few actively sought it in a wife. Her fortune, whilst respectable, was not large enough to overcome these disadvantages indefinitely. The Viscountess attempted intervention, but Lady Summersby would not be deterred. She listed, with brutal efficiency, the young women who had made successful matches that season: Miss Thornfield to Lord Ashworth, Miss Chambers to Sir Robert Whitley, and Miss Caroline Drayton to the extremely eligible Mr. Pemberton. Each had been younger, prettier, or richer than Genevieve, and each had approached matrimony with appropriate enthusiasm rather than philosophical objection. By the time they returned to Berkeley Square, Genevieve felt exhausted by society and its expectations. She informed her mother that she had developed a headache and would not be attending Lady Castlereagh's card party that evening. The Viscountess, recognizing defeat when she encountered it, merely sighed and requested that Genevieve at least appear at tomorrow evening's assembly at Almack's, as their patroness vouchers must not be wasted. The following morning dawned gray and threatening rain. Genevieve woke early, a plan forming in her mind that represented both rebellion and refuge. She would visit Hatchard's in Piccadilly, that sanctuary of literature where gentlewomen might browse without censure, accompanied only by their maids. There, surrounded by books rather than matrimonial scheming, she might find peace for a few precious hours. Her maid, Hannah, a sensible woman of 30 who had served the Sinclair family since Genevieve's childhood, prepared her mistress for the expedition with efficient silence. The walking dress selected was of fine corduroy, practical for uncertain weather, with a matching pelisse and bonnet. Genevieve took up her reticule, tucked a small volume of poetry within for propriety, and descended to find Hannah waiting in the hall. They walked the distance to Piccadilly, as the morning was fine despite the threatening clouds. Genevieve preferring the simple, rebellious exercise to the stuffiness and confinement of the carriage. The streets bustled with activity, vendors calling their wares, gentlemen on horseback navigating the morning traffic, ladies with their maids examining shop windows. London in season possessed an energy that Genevieve might have appreciated had it not centered so entirely upon courtship and matrimony. Hatchard's stood as an oasis of civilization amidst commercial chaos. The bookshop's bow windows displayed the latest publications, and its interior promised orderly rows of knowledge waiting to be discovered. Genevieve entered with the reverence others reserved for churches, breathing in the beloved scent of leather bindings and paper. She sent Hannah to the front with instructions to browse the novels, whilst she herself ventured deeper into the shop, toward the section dedicated to philosophy and natural sciences. Here, away from the casual browsers, she could examine works that would scandalize any proper lady's mamma. She ran her gloved fingers along the spines, reading titles with growing interest: treatises on astronomy, collections of geological observations, philosophical inquiries into the nature of knowledge itself. It was whilst absorbed in reading the preface to a newly published volume on chemistry that Genevieve became aware of another presence in the aisle. She glanced up to find a gentleman examining the shelf adjacent to her own, his attention apparently fixed upon a work of natural history. He appeared to be perhaps 24 or 25, dressed well but without ostentation in a coat of dark blue superfine and buckskin breeches. His hair, brown with hints of bronze in the shop's dim light, fell slightly across his forehead in a manner suggesting he had forgotten to visit his barber. What struck Genevieve most forcefully was not his appearance, which, whilst pleasing, was not remarkable enough to warrant particular notice, but rather the book he held. It was Darwin's Zoonomia, a work she had attempted to procure through her bookseller without success. She found herself staring at the volume with an intensity that bordered on impropriety. The gentleman noticed her attention and glanced up. His eyes, she observed, were gray or perhaps green. The shop's lighting made determination difficult. He offered a slight bow, appropriate for unintroduced persons of similar station sharing a public space, and returned his attention to the volume. Genevieve knew she should move away. Proper ladies did not engage strange gentlemen in conversation, even in bookshops. Yet the sight of that particular volume, combined with weeks of frustration at society's limitations and her mother's matrimonial campaign, produced a recklessness unusual even for her. She asked, her voice carefully modulated to suggest merely casual interest, whether he found the work worthwhile. The gentleman looked up again, surprise evident in his expression. After a moment's hesitation, he responded that he had not yet read it thoroughly, but understood it contained controversial theories about the development of living organisms. Thus began a conversation that would alter the course of 2 lives, though neither participant could have predicted such consequence at the time. They spoke of natural philosophy, of scientific observation versus received wisdom, of the tensions between religious doctrine and empirical evidence. The gentleman revealed knowledge that suggested university education, whilst Genevieve demonstrated learning that made him regard her with increasing interest. Time passed unmarked by either party. They moved from natural sciences to philosophy, discussing Locke and Hume, arguing the merits of empiricism versus rationalism. The gentleman expressed surprise at finding a lady so well versed in such subjects. Genevieve responded with barely concealed irritation that ladies possessed the same capacity for reason as gentlemen, lacking only educational opportunity. He apologized immediately, clarifying that his surprise stemmed not from her sex, but from the rarity of meeting anyone, male or female, who shared his interests. Most people, he observed with evident frustration, cared more for gossip and fashion than ideas. Genevieve found herself agreeing with an enthusiasm that quite overpowered propriety. They were interrupted by Hannah's discreet cough. The maid stood at the aisle's end, her expression suggesting they had been conversing far longer than appropriate. Genevieve started, suddenly aware that she had been speaking with a strange gentleman for what must have been nearly an hour, without introduction, without chaperone beyond her maid, in flagrant violation of every social rule she nominally observed. The gentleman also recognized the impropriety. He bowed again, this time more formally, and introduced himself as Mr. Alexander Beaumont. Genevieve, caught between propriety and honesty, gave her name as Miss Sinclair, omitting her courtesy title in sudden concern that her identity might alter the natural ease of their conversation. Mr. Beaumont asked if she came often to Hatchard's. Genevieve admitted she did, whenever escape from social obligations permitted. He expressed hope that they might meet again, perhaps to continue their discussion of Hume's epistemology. She found herself agreeing before prudence could intervene. They parted with mutual bows, Mr. Beaumont returning his attention to the shelves, whilst Genevieve allowed Hannah to guide her toward the front of the shop. She purchased 3 volumes she hardly noticed, her mind occupied entirely with the extraordinary conversation just concluded. On the walk home, Hannah maintained the diplomatic silence of a trusted servant who disapproves but will not presume to scold. Genevieve barely noticed, her thoughts circling repeatedly around Mr. Beaumont's observations about empirical philosophy and the particular intensity with which he had regarded her when she argued against Hume's skepticism. The evening's assembly at Almack's loomed with all the appeal of a public execution, yet Genevieve could not plead illness 2 nights consecutively without raising maternal concern. She submitted to her maid's ministrations with resignation, allowing herself to be dressed in a gown of white silk with delicate embroidery, the sort of insipid creation deemed suitable for unmarried ladies. Her hair was arranged in the fashionable style, with small curls framing her face, and the rest swept up with pearl combs that had belonged to her grandmother. The Viscountess examined her daughter with approval, tempered by experience. Genevieve looked appropriately lovely, but loveliness alone would not guarantee her cooperation in the evening's true purpose. Before they departed, she extracted a promise that Genevieve would dance at least twice and would not disappear into whatever quiet corner might offer refuge. Almac's assembly rooms on King Street represented the pinnacle of social exclusivity. Within its relatively plain walls, fortunes were made and reputations destroyed with a glance or a word from the patronesses who governed admission. Lady Jersey, Mrs. Drummond Burrell, Countess Leven, Princess Esterhazy, Lady Castlereagh, Lady Cowper, and the redoubtable Mrs. Burrell wielded power that dukes might envy, determining who might enter society's inner sanctum and who must remain forever outside. The Viscountess and her daughter arrived precisely at the fashionable hour, neither too early to appear eager nor too late to suggest indifference. They passed inspection by the patroness on duty, Lady Cowper this evening, looking elegant in purple silk, and entered the ballroom where the season's eligibles performed their ritualized mating dance. Genevieve surveyed the scene with the detachment of a natural philosopher observing specimens. Young ladies in white clustered like flocks of doves, their mammas stationed strategically around the room's perimeter. Gentlemen congregated near the refreshment table, where the famously insipid offerings at least provided occupation for idle hands. The orchestra played a country dance, and couples moved through the figures with varying degrees of grace. She had scarcely taken her position beside her mother when the evening's first trial arrived in the form of Lord Nathaniel Aldridge. His lordship, possessed of ginger hair and an unfortunate tendency to perspire, approached with his mother, the formidable Lady Aldridge. Introductions were performed, pleasantries exchanged, and an invitation to dance extended. Genevieve could not refuse without giving offense, so she allowed Lord Aldridge to lead her onto the floor for the cotillion just forming. His conversation during the dance consisted entirely of observations about the weather, the crush of people in attendance, and the excellence of his mother's recent card party. When he ventured to compliment Genevieve's appearance, comparing her eyes to forget-me-nots, she responded with a detailed explanation of the botanical characteristics of Myosotis, including its preference for moist soil and tendency toward aggressive spreading. Lord Aldridge appeared uncertain whether she was being clever or merely odd. By the dance's conclusion, his expression suggested he had settled upon the latter. He returned her to her mother with palpable relief, bowed with precise correctness, and retreated toward the refreshment table with admirable speed. The Viscountess sighed quietly but said nothing. She had learned through 3 seasons that scolding Genevieve for discouraging suitors merely provoked more dramatic displays of unsuitability. The second dance found Genevieve claimed by Sir Edmund Thorpe, a gentleman of perhaps 30 with thinning hair and an estate in Hertfordshire that he described in exhaustive detail. His 10,000 a year seemed to be his primary qualification for matrimony, as he referenced it no fewer than 5 times during their single dance together. When he inquired about Genevieve's accomplishments, she responded by discussing her study of Latin and her current reading of Tacitus in the original. Sir Edmund appeared startled. He observed that young ladies generally preferred novels to classical literature. Genevieve agreed that many did, then proceeded to discuss the relative merits of various Roman historians and their approaches to documenting imperial decline. By the time the dance concluded, Sir Edmund wore the glazed expression of one who has encountered something entirely outside his experience. He returned her to the Viscountess with remarks about the evening's warmth and a hasty bow. Genevieve watched him retreat toward a cluster of gentlemen near the card room, where he was immediately absorbed into conversation that, judging by their backward glances, concerned her. The Viscountess finally spoke, her voice low but pointed. She observed that Genevieve appeared determined to die an old maid, which was, of course, her choice to make. But perhaps she might consider that her mother would not live forever, and some thought should be given to her future security. Genevieve felt the familiar combination of guilt and frustration that such conversations inevitably produced. She loved her mother, Truly she did, but could not comprehend why she must marry simply to satisfy society's expectations. Before she could formulate a response that might be both honest and dutiful, her attention was captured by a disturbance near the entrance. A late arrival was being announced, and the ripple of interest that moved through the assembly suggested someone of considerable consequence. Genevieve stood slightly taller to see over the intervening heads, curiosity momentarily overcoming her determined disinterest in social proceedings. The gentleman who entered was tall, perhaps 30, with silver hair and an expression of supreme boredom. He was immediately surrounded by Lady Jersey and Mrs. Drummond Burrell, who appeared to be performing introductions with unusual enthusiasm. Behind him entered a younger gentleman, and it was this second man who caused Genevieve's breath to catch in her throat. Mr. Alexander Beaumont from Hatchard's stood surveying Almack's assembly rooms with an expression of polite interest that transformed into genuine surprise when his gaze found Genevieve across the crowded floor. For a moment they simply stared at one another, mutual recognition producing mutual shock. The Viscountess noticed her daughter's fixed attention and followed her gaze. She observed with interest that the newcomers appeared to be the Duke of Greystone and his son, Lord Alexander Beaumont, whose arrival in London for the season had been anticipated with considerable excitement. The Duke had been abroad for several years overseeing his extensive holdings, and his heir had rarely been seen in society, preferring Cambridge and the family's northern estates to London's matrimonial marketplace. The name echoed. Lord Alexander Beaumont. The name fitted the man in superfine, but not his demeanor. Genevieve heard her mother's words with a sensation of falling. She was not merely surprised, she was instantly humiliated by her own presumption, the idea that only an ordinary Mr. Beaumont could be worthy of her intellect. Lord Alexander, not Mr. Beaumont, some ordinary gentleman with whom she might have conversed as an equal, but Lord Alexander, heir to a dukedom, one of the most eligible bachelors in England. The man she had spoken with so freely, whose opinion she had valued precisely because she thought him unencumbered by excessive rank, was in fact so far above her station that their conversation in the bookshop must have seemed to him an amusing encounter with a presumptuous nobody. She felt heat rise in her cheeks, a combination of embarrassment and anger at her own foolishness. Of course he had been surprised by her learning, not because ladies were generally vapid, but because he had assumed her to be someone of no consequence, someone who could be indulged in intellectual pretension without social cost. The Viscountess continued her commentary, noting that Lord Alexander was considered handsome in addition to his other advantages, though he had acquired a reputation for avoiding society. Some said he was studious, others that he was proud. Several mammas had already attempted to secure introductions this season without success. His presence at Almack's suggested the Duke was finally prepared to see his heir married. Genevieve barely listened. She watched as Lady Jersey escorted the Duke and Lord Alexander around the room, performing introductions to the season's most eligible young ladies. Each introduction followed the same pattern. The lady blushed and curtsied, her mamma smiled with barely concealed triumph, Lord Alexander bowed with perfect courtesy whilst maintaining an expression of profound disinterest. When the introductions brought them inevitably to the Viscountess and her daughter, Genevieve found herself subjected to a praising examination by both the Duke and Lady Jersey. The Duke was cordial but distant, as befitted his rank. Lady Jersey performed the introduction with her customary enthusiasm, noting that Lady Genevieve was an accomplished young lady much admired for her wit. Lord Alexander bowed. His expression revealed nothing, but Genevieve thought she detected amusement in his gray-green eyes. He asked, with perfect courtesy, whether Lady Genevieve was engaged for the next dance. She wanted to refuse. Pride demanded she refuse. Yet refusal would require explanation, and any explanation must either reveal their previous encounter or appear as inexplicable rudeness to one of the season's most eligible gentlemen. The Viscountess was already beaming with maternal triumph. Lady Jersey watched with sharp interest. Genevieve accepted with as much grace as she could muster, placing her gloved hand upon his arm and allowing him to lead her onto the floor. The orchestra had struck up a waltz, that still slightly scandalous dance requiring permission from the patronesses before unmarried ladies might participate. Lady Jersey must have granted approval, for no one stopped them as Lord Alexander assumed the proper position, and they began to move through the steps. They danced in silence for several measures before he spoke, his voice low enough that only she could hear above the music. He expressed surprise at finding Miss Sinclair revealed as Lady Genevieve, daughter of the late Viscount Waverley, whose reputation for scholarship had been considerable even among those who considered such pursuits eccentric. Genevieve responded with equal quiet that she was no less surprised to discover Mr. Beaumont to be Lord Alexander, heir to a dukedom, whose presence at Hatchard's now seemed somewhat implausible given his rank and consequence. He smiled then, the first genuine expression she had seen since his arrival. He assured her that his interest in philosophy is sincere, regardless of his father's titles. He frequented Hatchard's precisely because it was one place he might be simply Mr. Beaumont, interested in ideas rather than estates and consequence. She asked why he had not corrected her assumption. He countered by asking why she had omitted her courtesy title. They regarded one another with mutual understanding born of shared deception, and despite her determination to remain aloof, Genevieve felt amusement breaking through her defensive anger. The dance concluded too quickly. Lord Alexander returned her to her mother with a request that he might call upon them at Berkeley Square. The Viscountess granted permission with transparent delight, whilst Genevieve maintained carefully neutral expression. The remainder of the evening passed in a blur of introductions and dances, though Genevieve found it impossible to concentrate on any conversation whilst her mind remained fixed upon the revelation of Lord Alexander's identity. She danced with Lord Ashford, whose conversation consisted entirely of hunting stories, and with Mr. Geoffrey Hartwell, who spent the entirety of their dance describing his new phaeton's superior engineering. To each, she responded with the bare minimum required by politeness, earning further disapproving glances from her increasingly frustrated mother. When they finally departed Almack's near midnight, the Viscountess could barely contain her triumph. Lord Alexander Beaumont had danced with Genevieve, had requested permission to call, had shown every sign of particular interest, despite dozens of other young ladies vying for his attention. Surely even Genevieve must recognize this as an opportunity beyond the ordinary. Genevieve made no response beyond acknowledging she was tired. In truth, she felt utterly confused. The gentleman she had met at Hatchard's had interested her precisely because she thought him ordinary, someone with whom she might converse freely without the complications of rank and matrimonial expectation. The revelation that he was heir to a dukedom changed everything. Or did it? Their conversation about philosophy had been genuine, she was certain. Yet how could she trust her own judgment when she had been so thoroughly mistaken about his identity? She retired to her chamber with relief, dismissing Hannah after the complicated business of removing gown, corset, and the pins, securing her elaborate coiffure. Alone at last, she sat at her dressing table in her night rail, regarding her reflection with unusual attention. Was she pretty? Society seemed to think not, or at least not pretty enough to overcome her reputation for inappropriate learning. Her features were regular enough, dark eyes beneath well-defined brows, a straight nose, a mouth perhaps slightly too wide for perfect beauty. Her figure, when not constrained by corsetry, was slender but not fashionably willowy. She looked, she decided, exactly like what she was, a young woman of good family and adequate fortune whose chief distinguishing feature was a stubborn refusal to pretend stupidity for masculine comfort. Why, then, had Lord Alexander requested permission to call? Perhaps he found her conversation amusing in the way one might find a performing dog amusing. Interesting precisely because unexpected. Or perhaps he was one of those gentlemen who enjoyed intellectual women as curiosities, whilst ultimately marrying someone suitably conventional. She climbed into bed with these uncomfortable thoughts, circling through her mind like moths around a candle flame. Sleep, when it finally came, brought dreams of bookshops and ballrooms confused together, where she argued philosophy whilst waltzing through endless library aisles. The following afternoon, precisely at the fashionable hour for morning calls, Lord Alexander Beaumont arrived at the Berkeley Square residence with a correctness that allowed no complaint. He was received in the drawing room, where the Viscountess presided with barely suppressed satisfaction, and Genevieve sat with outward composure that concealed profound uncertainty about how to navigate this unexpected complication. Lord Alexander had brought flowers, a bouquet of roses and lilies arranged with tasteful restraint, which he presented to the Viscountess with appropriate compliments. He inquired after their health, commented favorably upon the weather, and demonstrated every indication of a gentleman paying a perfectly ordinary social call. Yet when conversation turned to literature, his expression grew animated, and Genevieve recognized the same enthusiasm he had displayed at Hatchard's. The Viscountess, demonstrating the tactical brilliance that had successfully navigated 3 seasons, excused herself after a quarter hour on pretense of correspondence requiring immediate attention. Propriety was maintained by leaving the drawing-room door open and positioning herself in the nearby morning room where she might serve as technical chaperone whilst remaining out of earshot. Thus liberated from maternal supervision whilst maintaining appearance of propriety, Genevieve and Lord Alexander regarded one another with the wariness of duelists assessing opponents' strengths. He spoke first, acknowledging that their meeting at Hatchard's had occurred under false pretenses on both sides, though he hoped she did not hold his omission of title against him more harshly than he held hers. Genevieve responded that she considered them equally culpable, though she questioned why a gentleman of his station would care whether a stranger knew his rank. Lord Alexander replied that rank brought complications he had found exhausting since achieving his majority. Every conversation became calculation, every acquaintance potentially mercenary. At Hatchard's, discussing philosophy with Miss Sinclair, who seemed genuinely interested in ideas rather than consequence, he had experienced rare freedom to be simply himself. She found his honesty disarming, though pride prevented her from admitting it. Instead, she observed that Lady Genevieve presumably presented similar complications, being the object of her mother's matrimonial schemes and society's expectations. He acknowledged the parallel, then ventured to ask whether Lady Genevieve had meant what she said about marriage being institutionalized oppression. His tone suggested genuine curiosity rather than mockery, which emboldened her to speak with unusual frankness. She explained her position, that marriage under English law rendered women legally non-existent, their property and persons entirely subject to husband's control. A wife could not refuse her husband's demands, could not leave regardless of cruelty, could not even claim legal right to her own children. The institution did not serve love, but rather property transfer and dynastic continuation, with women's happiness utterly incidental to these purposes. Lord Alexander listened without interruption, his expression thoughtful. When she concluded, he asked whether she truly believed all marriages followed this pattern, or whether she objected to the legal structure rather than the institution itself. Surely there must be marriages of genuine affection and mutual respect, even within imperfect legal frameworks. Genevieve admitted grudgingly that happy marriages existed, citing her parents as example. Yet she maintained that individual happiness did not excuse systemic injustice, and that she could not, in good conscience, participate in an institution predicated upon women's subordination. He observed that her position placed her in difficult circumstances, as society offered few alternatives for unmarried women beyond dependence upon male relatives. Genevieve acknowledged this bitterly, noting that she recognized the hypocrisy of criticizing marriage whilst relying upon her father's fortune for independence. Their conversation continued in this vein for the remaining acceptable duration of a morning call, covering topics from women's education to property law reform. When Lord Alexander finally took his leave, expressing hope that they might continue their discussion at Lady Montrose's ball the following week, Genevieve felt thoroughly confused. He was not at all what she expected from a future duke, yet that made him potentially more dangerous to her resolution, not less. The Viscountess emerged from her strategic position in the morning room, wearing an expression of cautious optimism. She noted that Lord Alexander had stayed precisely the correct duration, had demonstrated particular attention to Genevieve's conversation, and had secured her promise to save him dances at the upcoming ball. These were excellent signs, though she counseled against excessive optimism given Genevieve's talent for discouraging eligible suitors. The following days brought a flurry of social engagements that seemed specifically designed to test Genevieve's patience. She attended Lady Hartwell's musicale, where Miss Dorothy Kendrick's soprano soared through Italian arias, whilst her audience maintained expressions of cultivated appreciation. She endured Mrs. Worthing's Venetian breakfast, an afternoon entertainment despite its name, where young ladies paraded their accomplishments whilst mamas exchanged intelligence about eligible gentlemen's fortunes and characters. At each event, Genevieve found herself sought out by Lord Alexander with a consistency that provoked considerable comment among the observant. He partnered her at whist during Lady Summersby's card party, where they won handily despite her initial distraction. He appeared at the Royal Academy exhibition, where they discovered mutual appreciation for landscape painting and shared skepticism about certain fashionable portraitists' excessive flattery of subjects. Most significantly, he seemed to seek her opinion rather than merely her company. When Lady Jersey's dinner party turned to discussion of the war with France, Lord Alexander addressed several observations directly to Genevieve, treating her political analysis with the same respect he afforded the gentlemen present. When Mr. Henry Cavendish, a distinguished natural philosopher, attended Lady Montrose's soirée, Lord Alexander ensured Genevieve was introduced and included in their conversation about recent experiments with gases. This behavior was unprecedented in Genevieve's experience of masculine attention. The few gentlemen who had previously shown interest in her had done so despite her intelligence, treating her learning as an unfortunate eccentricity to be politely overlooked. Lord Alexander, conversely, appeared to value her mind as much as her person, seeking her thoughts on subjects ranging from agricultural reform to the merits of Gothic architecture. Yet this very attention troubled Genevieve more deeply than simple dismissal ever had. She found herself anticipating his presence at social events, felt disappointment when he failed to appear, and caught herself dwelling upon their conversations long after they concluded. These were precisely the symptoms she had observed in other young ladies pursuing matrimonial objectives, and their appearance in herself filled her with alarmed confusion. The situation came to crisis at Lady Montrose's ball, a particularly elaborate affair celebrating her ladyship's birthday. The Montrose residence in Grosvenor Square had been transformed for the occasion, with additional musicians hired and supper laid that reportedly cost upwards of £500. Every person of consequence in London attended, creating such a crush that movement through the ballroom required strategic planning. Genevieve arrived with her mother to find Lord Alexander already present, engaged in conversation with several gentlemen near the terrace doors. He caught sight of her almost immediately and made his excuses to his companions with flattering haste. Within moments he stood before her, requesting the honor of the first waltz, with an expression of such particular attention that several mammas turned to observe with undisguised interest. She granted permission, because refusal would have been remarked upon, and they took their positions as the orchestra began. Dancing with Lord Alexander had become familiar through repetition, yet Genevieve found each occasion no less affecting than the last. He moved with athletic grace unusual in gentlemen of his rank, leading with confident assurance that made following effortless even in the crush of dancers. As they turned through the waltz's figures, Lord Alexander spoke quietly of having visited Hatchard's again that morning. He had purchased the volume on chemistry she had been examining during their first meeting and found it fascinating, though he confessed some passages exceeded his understanding of the subject. He wondered whether Lady Genevieve might be willing to discuss it with him, perhaps during a drive in Hyde Park at the fashionable hour when proper society gathered. Genevieve felt her carefully maintained defenses beginning to crumble. She wanted to accept, wanted it with an intensity that frightened her. Yet accepting meant acknowledging what his continued attention implied, that Lord Alexander Beaumont, heir to a dukedom, sought not merely her conversation, but her particular regard. And if she admitted to wanting his regard in return, what became of her principles, her determination to remain free of matrimonial bondage? She temporized, suggesting that chemistry was perhaps not suitable topic for public park conversation. He smiled and countered that they might discuss whatever subjects she deemed appropriate, as he valued her company regardless of conversational content. This declaration, delivered with quiet sincerity whilst they revolved through crowded ballroom, left Genevieve speechless for several measures. The waltz concluded before she could formulate adequate response. Lord Alexander returned her to the Viscountess, but not before securing her promise for the supper dance later that evening. He bowed and withdrew to his gentlemanly obligations elsewhere, leaving Genevieve in state of unprecedented emotional confusion. The evening's subsequent hours passed in mechanical succession. She danced with Lord Ashford again, who had apparently forgiven her botanical lecture sufficiently to request a country dance. She partnered Mr. Reginald Fletcher, a younger son with political ambitions, who monopolized their dance time with detailed explanation of his proposed parliamentary reforms. She even endured a quadrille with Lord Nathaniel Aldridge, whose conversational repertoire had not improved since their last encounter. Yet throughout these obligatory partnerships, Genevieve's attention remained fixed upon Lord Alexander across the ballroom. She observed him dancing with Miss Lavinia Hartley, whose pretty face wore its habitual expression of vapid pleasure. She watched him leading Miss Caroline Sutton through a country dance, noting how politely he attended to her conversation whilst maintaining expression of profound disinterest. And when Lady Georgiana Cavendish, possessed of both remarkable beauty and substantial fortune, claimed him for a waltz, Genevieve experienced an unfamiliar sensation that she reluctantly identified as jealousy. This recognition forced her to acknowledge what she had been denying for weeks. She had developed feelings for Lord Alexander Beaumont that transcended intellectual appreciation. She was falling in love, precisely the trap she had sworn to avoid, with precisely the sort of man who represented everything she claimed to oppose. He was heir to a dukedom, positioned at society's apex, beneficiary of the very system that oppressed women. That he seemed different, that he treated her as intellectual equal rather than decorative inferior, might be merely sophisticated seduction rather than genuine regard. These troubling reflections occupied her until the supper dance, when Lord Alexander claimed her for the promenaded walk to the dining room. They joined the procession of couples moving through elaborately decorated halls toward tables laden with delicacies. Lord Alexander secured them places at a smaller table somewhat removed from the general crush, where conversation might proceed with relative privacy despite surrounding company. Supper at such events followed established patterns. Gentlemen fetched plates of delicacies for their partners, conversation flowed lightly across neutral topics, and the entire affair served primarily to allow courting couples sanctioned time together. Lord Alexander performed his role impeccably, bringing Genevieve selections of lobster patties, cold meats, and delicate pastries arranged upon fine china. Yet once seated, he abandoned neutral topics entirely. He spoke instead of his estate in Northumberland, describing the landscape with genuine affection, wild moorlands and ancient forests, a house built during Elizabeth's reign that had been in his family for 10 generations. He confessed that he preferred it to London, found society's endless rounds of entertainment exhausting, and looked forward to the season's conclusion when he might return north. Genevieve listened with growing interest. She asked about the estate's management, and Lord Alexander responded with detailed explanation of agricultural improvements he had implemented, tenant relationships he had worked to reform, and his attempts to establish a school for the estate children. His passion for these projects was evident, and she found herself reassessing her assumptions about aristocratic indifference to those dependent upon them. He asked then about her own interests beyond philosophy and science. She spoke hesitatingly of a vague desire to do something meaningful, though she knew not what. Teaching, perhaps, or charitable work, though neither seemed available to women of her station. She felt frustrated by the narrowness of permitted female activity, the waste of education and capability that society demanded. Lord Alexander suggested that perhaps marriage to the right partner might expand rather than contract her possibilities. A wife of standing had influence through her husband, could direct charitable endeavors, could shape estate policies. He spoke carefully, as though testing dangerous waters, but his meaning was clear enough. Genevieve responded with arguments rehearsed over 3 seasons, that influence through another was not autonomy, that a wife's activities existed entirely at her husband's sufferance, that legal non-existence could not be compensated by benevolent masculine permission. She spoke with passion born of long-held conviction, though her voice remained low enough not to disturb neighboring conversations. Lord Alexander listened without interruption, his expression thoughtful rather than defensive. When she finished, he asked quietly whether she had ever considered that partnership might exist within marriage, that 2 people of mutual respect and affection might navigate legal limitations together rather than allowing them to define their relationship entirely. Before Genevieve could respond, they were interrupted by Lady Montrose herself, who descended upon their table with her usual overwhelming enthusiasm. She declared them a charming couple, expressed hope of hearing wedding bells before season's end, and moved on to terrorize other guests before either could protest this premature assumption. The interruption shattered their conversational intimacy. They finished supper with awkward pleasantries and returned to the ballroom, where the Viscountess claimed Genevieve for introduction to yet another potential suitor. Lord Alexander bowed and withdrew, leaving her to endure Mr. Augustus Pemberton's detailed description of his family's lucrative shipping interests. The evening concluded near 2 a.m, with Genevieve's head aching from punch and confusion. During the carriage ride home, the Viscountess spoke enthusiastically of Lord Alexander's obvious preference, noting that he had danced with Genevieve twice and sat with her at supper, marking her as particular object of his attention. Such behavior from London's most eligible bachelor represented opportunity beyond the Viscountess's wildest maternal hopes. Genevieve made no response. She retired to her chamber, dismissed Hannah, and sat before her mirror in profound uncertainty. Everything she had believed about marriage, about masculine intention, about the impossibility of partnership within legal subordination, was being challenged by one man whose attention she could no longer pretend not to want. The invitation to visit Vauxhall Gardens arrived 3 days later, extended through proper channels by the Duke of Greystone himself. His Grace was hosting a party to view the famous pleasure gardens, and Lady Genevieve Sinclair and the Viscountess were particularly invited. The inclusion of Lady Genevieve's name specifically, rather than a general invitation to the Sinclair household, left no doubt about the invitation's true purpose. The Viscountess received the invitation with barely contained triumph. Vauxhall Gardens, with its tree-lined walks and relative privacy, provided ideal setting for courtship under guise of group entertainment. That the Duke himself was facilitating his heir's pursuit of Genevieve suggested serious matrimonial intent. Genevieve agreed to attend with resignation approaching dread. She could no longer deny her feelings for Lord Alexander, yet accepting those feelings meant confronting questions she had avoided throughout 3 seasons. Could she marry? Could she surrender legal autonomy to any man, even one who seemed to respect her mind? Could she reconcile her principles with her heart's desires? The evening of the Vauxhall party arrived with perfect spring weather. Genevieve dressed with unusual care in a gown of pale green silk that Hannah assured her was most becoming. Her hair was arranged simply but elegantly, and she wore her mother's pearl earrings rather than her usual plain studs. The Viscountess observed these preparations with knowing satisfaction but wisely refrained from comment. They traveled to Vauxhall by river as was customary, boarding the Duke's private barge at Westminster Stairs along with several other guests. The journey proved pleasant, with the Thames reflecting evening sunlight and the air carrying scents of water and approaching spring. Lord Alexander handed Genevieve aboard with particular care. His touch through her gloved hand, sending sensations she tried unsuccessfully to ignore. The Duke's party numbered perhaps 20 persons, including several distinguished families and their eligible offspring. Lady Hartwell attended with her daughter Lavinia, who simpered at Lord Alexander with predictable regularity. Mr. and Mrs. Worthing brought their nephew, a serious young man recently returned from Grand Tour. And most unexpectedly, Felicity Danvers appeared with Captain Harcourt, now her fiancé, their engagement having been announced the previous week. Vauxhall Gardens at evening presented enchanting spectacle. Thousands of lamps illuminated tree-lined walks and ornate pavilions where supper would later be served. Music drifted from the orchestra pavilion, and well-dressed crowds promenaded through carefully designed landscapes that transformed London's commercial reality into romantic fantasy. The Duke's party divided naturally after initial exploration, with older guests gravitating towards supper boxes whilst younger members dispersed along various walks. Lord Alexander offered his arm to Genevieve with an expression that brooked no refusal, and she found herself accepting before considering whether doing so constituted tacit acknowledgement of his pursuit. They walked in silence for several paces, the music and laughter of the crowds around them a distant hum that failed to break the charged atmosphere. Lord Alexander spoke first, remarking upon the evening's beauty with a banality that suggested he too felt uncertain how to navigate the unspoken tension between them. Genevieve agreed, equally banal, and they continued walking whilst carefully avoiding topics of any substance. This awkwardness persisted until they reached a more isolated section of the gardens, where Fountain played in a small clearing surrounded by trees hung with lanterns. Here, Lord Alexander stopped, turned to face her directly, and spoke with sudden intensity that swept away all pretense of casual conversation. He told her that he had initially sought her company because their conversation at Hatchard's had been the most stimulating intellectual exchange he had experienced in months. He had continued seeking her company because he found her remarkable in ways extending far beyond intelligence. And he now found himself in the unprecedented position of wanting to court a woman who had declared marriage itself to be institutionalized oppression. Genevieve listened with heart beating uncomfortably fast. She wanted to respond with her usual arguments about legal subordination and female autonomy, but the words would not come. Instead, she found herself asking quietly what he wanted from her. Lord Alexander responded with careful honesty. He acknowledged that he was expected to marry, that his position required securing the succession, that duty demanded he select an appropriate wife of good family and unblemished reputation. Yet he found himself entirely uninterested in appropriate wives and profoundly interested in inappropriate Genevieve, who challenged him intellectually whilst making him question assumptions he had accepted without examination. He asked whether she believed partnership within marriage to be impossible or merely unlikely, whether she rejected the institution entirely or only its most oppressive manifestations, whether she might consider that not all men sought to dominate their wives, that some might genuinely desire equal partnership constrained only by legal forms neither party controlled. Genevieve felt her defenses crumbling entirely. She admitted that her parents' marriage had been partnership of minds as well as hearts, that she had observed other happy unions despite legal inequality. Yet she maintained that individual exceptions did not excuse systemic injustice, and that she could not in good conscience enter an arrangement predicated upon her legal non-existence. Lord Alexander asked what would satisfy her principles whilst acknowledging her heart, if indeed her heart was engaged. He spoke carefully, but his meaning was clear. He was offering marriage and wanted to know what terms might make it acceptable to her despite her philosophical objections. This direct approach forced Genevieve to confront her own evasions. She had spent 3 seasons hiding behind theoretical objections to avoid admitting deeper fear, that she might lose herself in marriage, subordinate her identity to another's, disappear into the legal and social category of wife without retaining anything of Genevieve. She had seen it happen to intelligent women who became shadows of their husbands, their own thoughts and interests abandoned in service of masculine priority. She spoke these fears aloud for the first time, her voice shaking with emotion she usually suppressed. Lord Alexander listened without interruption, and when she finished, he took her hand with gentle deliberation. He acknowledged he could not change English law, could not grant her legal autonomy that marriage would eliminate. But he could promise, before God and his own honor, that he would never ask her to diminish herself for his comfort. That he valued her mind as much as her person. That he wanted a wife who challenged him rather than simply agreeing with him. That their marriage, if she would consent to it, would be partnership of equals bound by affection and respect rather than merely legal constraint. Genevieve felt tears threatening, which she fought with determination born of 3 seasons maintaining composure. She asked how she could trust such promises when law gave him absolute authority to break them without consequence. He responded that trust must ultimately rest upon character rather than legal structure, and that she must decide whether she believed his character worthy of trust. They stood thus in lamplight by the fountain, whilst music drifted from distant orchestra and other couples passed through the gardens around them. Genevieve found herself at precipice she had avoided throughout 3 seasons of determined spinsterhood. She could retreat to safety of her principles, refuse Lord Alexander's implicit proposal, and maintain consistency at cost of happiness. Or she could trust that this particular man might honor promises that law did not require him to keep. Before she could respond, they were interrupted by Felicity and Captain Harcourt, who rounded the path with expressions suggesting they had been searching. Felicity apologized for the interruption, but explained that the Duke was assembling guests for supper in the pavilion, and their absence had been noted. The moment was broken. Lord Alexander released Genevieve's hand and offered his arm with correct formality. They rejoined the larger party for supper, where cold meats, pastries, and buspunchten were served in the elaborately decorated box the Duke had reserved. Conversation flowed around them, but Genevieve barely attended, her mind entirely occupied with the choice before her. The following week brought the season's most significant event, the Duchess of Devonshire's ball, an entertainment so exclusive that invitations were sought with desperate intensity by those outside the innermost circle of society. The Sinclairs received their invitation as a matter of course, their families standing, ensuring their inclusion despite Genevieve's reputation for eccentricity. Preparation for such an event consumed days. New gowns were ordered, with the Viscountess insisting that Genevieve be attired with unusual elegance. The modiste produced a creation of white silk, overlaid with silver gauze, embroidered with delicate flowers, and cut to showcase Genevieve's figure whilst maintaining strictest propriety. Matching slippers, long gloves, and her grandmother's diamond earrings completed an ensemble designed to present her as serious matrimonial prospect rather than intellectual curiosity. Genevieve submitted to these preparations with unprecedented cooperation. Since Vauxhall, she had thought of little beyond Lord Alexander's words and her own response. She had not seen him in the intervening days, as he had departed London briefly on estate business. Yet his absence served only to clarify her feelings. She missed him with intensity that confirmed what she had been reluctant to admit even to herself. The evening of the ball, she dressed with care and examined her reflection with new eyes. She looked, she thought, like someone who might plausibly attract the heir to a dukedom. More importantly, she looked like herself, rather than some pale imitation of fashionable young ladies whose company she had always disdained. The ball itself exceeded all expectations for magnificence. Devonshire House blazed with thousands of candles, its rooms filled with flowers and decorated with elaborate care. The guests represented the absolute pinnacle of British society, princes of the blood, ambassadors from foreign courts, distinguished politicians, and every family of significant rank. To be seen here represented ultimate social triumph. To be overlooked constituted social death. The Sinclairs arrived at the fashionable hour to find the ballroom already crowded with guests. The Viscountess navigated through throngs with practiced ease, exchanging greetings whilst positioning them advantageously for observing new arrivals. Genevieve searched the crowd for Lord Alexander without success, experiencing disappointment that surprised her with its intensity. The evening proceeded through its prescribed course. She danced with Lord Ashford yet again, with Mr. Geoffrey Hartwell, whose conversation had not improved, and with young Lord Somerville, who spoke exclusively of his horses. Between dances, she endured her mother's increasingly anxious observations about Lord Alexander's continued absence. It was during the supper interval that disaster struck. Genevieve had retreated to the ladies' withdrawing room to repair a torn flounce when she overheard conversation between two young ladies she recognized but did not know well. Miss Harriet Weston and Miss Anne Thornbury, both known for their beauty and their sharp tongues. They spoke in voices pitched to carry, discussing Lord Alexander Beaumont with amusement edged with malice. Miss Weston observed that his pursuit of Lady Genevieve Sinclair had been the season's most unexpected development. Miss Thornbury agreed, adding that she had it on excellent authority, her brother being friend to Lord Alexander's cousin, that the whole affair was merely amusement for a gentleman bored by conventional beauties. Genevieve stood frozen behind the screen that divided the withdrawing room, unable to reveal her presence without admitting she had overheard. She heard Miss Thornbury laugh and state the money was for seeing if the notorious Bluestocking, with all her talk of female autonomy and legal injustice, could be won over by rank and attention alone. Miss Weston continued, apparently Lord Alexander had wagered with his cousin Lord Markham that he could make the season's most notorious Bluestocking fall in love with him, proving that even the most intellectual woman could be swayed by sufficient rank and attention. The wager, Miss Weston added, was for the scandalous sum of 1,000 guineas, and that the loser must withdraw from London society for a year, a price greater than any sum to a man socially ambitious. The wager was for £500, to be paid when Lord Alexander successfully secured Lady Genevieve's obvious infatuation. Miss Thornbury laughed and observed that poor Lady Genevieve, with all her philosophy and learning, had been utterly taken in. She wondered whether the announcement of Lord Alexander's actual betrothal to Miss Diana Fairfax would be made tonight, as rumour suggested. Miss Fairfax possessed everything appropriate for a future duchess: beauty, impeccable lineage, substantial fortune, and refreshing lack of intellectual pretension. The ladies departed, their conversation fading into distant halls. Genevieve remained behind the screen, feeling as though she had been physically struck. Every interaction with Lord Alexander replayed through her mind with new, humiliating interpretation. His interest in her conversation, had it been merely strategic amusement? His apparent respect for her intelligence, had it been sophisticated mockery? His words at Vauxhall about partnership and trust, had they been calculated seduction toward winning his wager? She returned to the ballroom in state of barely controlled emotion. Pride demanded she maintain composure, but shock made every movement feel mechanical. She found her mother conversing with Lady Montrose and joined them with smile that felt like rictus. It was then that Lord Alexander finally arrived, entering the ballroom with his father and a young lady Genevieve recognized from previous events. Miss Diana Fairfax, celebrated beauty whose debut 2 seasons prior had caused sensation. Miss Fairfax was everything Genevieve was not: blonde, conventionally pretty, accomplished in all feminine arts without being threateningly intellectual. She wore pale pink silk that complemented her coloring perfectly, and she looked up at Lord Alexander with expression of sweet admiration as they entered together. The Duchess of Devonshire herself greeted them at the ballroom entrance, suggesting by this attention that the evening held some special significance. The Duke of Greystone wore expression of paternal satisfaction. Lord Alexander appeared serious, but not unhappy as he led Miss Fairfax into the ballroom's center. Genevieve watched this tableau with sensation of falling. She had been correct all along. Marriage was trap, masculine attention was deception, and her philosophical objections had been protection she should never have abandoned. She had allowed herself to believe Lord Alexander different, had begun to trust his words about partnership and respect, and had been preparing to surrender her principles for the sake of emotions she should have suppressed entirely. Lord Alexander's gaze found her across the crowded ballroom. His expression shifted from polite attention to confusion as he registered her presence, then to concern as he observed something in her face that alarmed him. He began moving toward her, leaving Miss Fairfax with his father, but Genevieve would not face him after what she had overheard. She made hasty excuses to her mother and Lady Montrose, claiming sudden illness brought on by the ballroom's heat. The Viscountess appeared concerned, but accepted the excuse, arranging their immediate departure. Within moments they were in their carriage, rolling through London streets toward Berkeley Square, whilst Genevieve fought tears that pride refused to allow. The Viscountess attempted conversation, but Genevieve could not respond without breaking entirely. She maintained silence until they reached home, then fled to her chamber where she finally allowed herself to weep with abandon. Hannah attended her with silent sympathy, removing the beautiful gown and elaborate coiffure, whilst Genevieve cried over dreams she should never have permitted herself to dream. Mourning brought not relief, but rather grim determination. Genevieve woke to certainty that she had been saved from terrible mistake. She had nearly surrendered everything, her principles, her independence, her very self, for what proved to be nothing more than aristocratic wager. That the humiliation had been private rather than public constituted small mercy. The Viscountess appeared at breakfast with expression of concerned confusion. Lord Alexander had called already this morning, shockingly early, barely past 10, requesting urgent interview with Lady Genevieve. The Viscountess had informed him that her daughter was indisposed and could not receive visitors. He had left a note which he begged might be delivered immediately. Genevieve took the sealed paper with trembling hands. She wanted to throw it unopened into the fire, but curiosity overcame pride. The message was brief. Lady Genevieve, I must speak with you immediately. Whatever you have heard or believe you have learned, I beg you will allow me to explain before drawing conclusions. What passed between us at Vauxhall was entirely sincere. Please grant me audience, or if you refuse that, at least read the enclosed letter. Your servant, Alexander Beaumont. A second, longer letter was folded within the first. Genevieve hesitated, then took both papers to her father's study where she might read in privacy. She unfolded the longer letter and began to read Lord Alexander's distinctive hand. The letter began with direct acknowledgement of what Genevieve must have overheard, for he had learned from his cousin that Miss Weston and Miss Thornbury had been spreading precisely such rumors at the Duchess's ball. Every word of their conversation had been calculated malice built upon deliberately twisted truth. Yes, Lord Markham had proposed a wager early in the season, suggesting that the notorious intellectual Lady Genevieve could be made to fall in love despite her professed disdain for marriage. Lord Alexander had refused the wager immediately, and in terms that ended his friendship with Lord Markham permanently. He had told his cousin that Lady Genevieve possessed more intelligence and integrity than any lady of their acquaintance, and that any man who wagered upon a woman's feelings deserved contempt rather than friendship. Yet Lord Markham, bitter at this rejection, had apparently been spreading lies suggesting Lord Alexander had accepted the wager. This malicious fiction had been repeated and embellished until it reached the virulent form that Genevieve had unfortunately overheard. As for Miss Diana Fairfax, she was betrothed not to Lord Alexander, but to his younger brother, Captain James Beaumont, who had been serving in India with his regiment. James had returned unexpectedly, and the announcement of his engagement to Miss Fairfax, arranged during their youth by their respective parents, would be made shortly. Lord Alexander had been escorting his future sister-in-law at his father's request, performing family duty, whilst his brother concluded military obligations. The letter continued with impassioned declaration that everything Lord Alexander had said at Vauxhall was true. His interest in Genevieve was profound and sincere. His respect for her intelligence was genuine. His desire for partnership rather than domination was an honest statement of his values. He loved her not despite her mind, but because of it. And he could not bear that malicious gossip should destroy what had been building between them. He concluded with request that she meet him, allow him to explain in person, and give him opportunity to prove his sincerity. He would wait in Hyde Park at the fashionable hour this afternoon, near the Serpentine, hoping she would come. Genevieve read the letter 3 times, her emotions churning from humiliation to hope to confusion. Could she believe him? Should she? Pride argued she had been sufficiently foolish already. Yet something in the letter's tone, its direct confrontation of the accusations rather than evasion, rang true. She sat in her father's study for nearly an hour, the letter before her while spring sunlight crept across the desk. Finally, she made her decision. She would go to Hyde Park, would hear Lord Alexander's explanation in person, and would trust her own judgment rather than anonymous gossip or defensive pride. She dressed with care in a walking dress of bronze silk, practical yet becoming. Hannah attended her with expression suggesting she knew something significant was occurring, but possessed too much discretion to inquire. The Viscountess raised eyebrows at Genevieve's sudden desire for afternoon promenade in Hyde Park, but raised no actual objection when informed that Hannah would serve as chaperone. They walked the familiar route to Hyde Park, entering near Stanhope Gate and following paths toward the Serpentine. The fashionable hour was approaching, and society was gathering for its daily ritual of seeing and being seen. Carriages rolled along Rotten Row, whilst riders demonstrated their horsemanship, and pedestrians promenaded in elaborate dress. Lord Alexander waited near the Serpentine as promised, his posture tense like a man awaiting a sentence, and he was visibly without his carriage or groom, having walked a considerable distance in blatant disregard of aristocratic custom. His expression when he saw Genevieve approach combined relief with such obvious emotion that several nearby observers turned to watch with undisguised interest. He bowed formally, requested permission to walk with her, and they proceeded along the water's edge, with Hannah trailing at discreet distance. For several moments, neither spoke. The silence filled with everything unspoken between them. Finally, Lord Alexander began, speaking rapidly as though afraid she might flee before he finished. He repeated what his letter had explained: Lord Markham's offensive wager, his own furious refusal, the subsequent spread of malicious lies. He acknowledged he should have warned her that such gossip might circulate, but had foolishly believed his complete lack of response to Lord Markham's proposal would have silenced speculation. He spoke then of Miss Fairfax and his brother James, explaining the family connection and his father's request that he escort her during James's absence. He acknowledged this had been poorly timed given the circumstances, but he had not imagined gossip would combine these separate elements into such damaging fiction. Genevieve listened, whilst watching ducks glide across the Serpentine's calm water. She asked quietly how she could know any of this was true. Perhaps this too was calculated seduction, designed to overcome her renewed resistance. Lord Alexander stopped walking and turned to face her directly. He spoke with intensity that drew curious glances from passing society. He could not prove his sincerity except through time and consistent behavior. He could not demonstrate his love except by showing it through actions extending beyond the present moment. He could only ask that she trust him enough to give him that opportunity. He acknowledged that she had been correct all along about marriage's legal injustices. He could not change law, could not grant her legal equality that English courts denied. But he could give his word before God and upon his honor that their marriage would be partnership in every sense that human will could make it so. He looked directly into her eyes and stated, "I will not use the very law you despise, the law that I too have seen cause misery, to demand your submission." He would value her counsel, respect her intelligence, ensure she retained identity beyond being simply his duchess. He would love her not as possession, but as partner, not as inferior, but as equal, constrained only by laws neither controlled. Genevieve felt tears threatening again, but this time from emotion entirely different than previous night's despair. She asked what he wanted from her. Lord Alexander responded with simple directness. He wanted her to marry him, to trust him, to build life together that would prove such trust warranted. She stood silent, watching water and struggling with decision that would determine her entire future. Everything she had believed about marriage argued she should refuse. Every principle she had maintained through 3 seasons demanded she reject his proposal, as she had rejected all others. Yet her heart insisted this was different, that Lord Alexander was different, that love might indeed be possible without complete surrender of self. Finally she spoke, her voice steady despite emotional turmoil. She could not promise immediate acceptance of his proposal, as her principles would not permit such hasty capitulation to feeling over reason. But she would permit him to court her properly, to prove through behavior over time that his words matched his intentions. If after such courtship she remained convinced of his sincerity, then perhaps, she might consider marriage to be something other than imprisonment. Lord Alexander's face transformed with joy so evident that several passing ladies whispered behind their fans. He took Genevieve's hand with careful reverence, raised it to his lips in gesture that was more promise than mere courtesy, and spoke his gratitude with emotion that suggested her conditional acceptance meant more to him than unconditional surrender ever could. The weeks that followed established new pattern in Genevieve's life. Lord Alexander called at Berkeley Square daily, bringing flowers and conversation, discussing philosophy and politics with equal enthusiasm. They rode in Hyde Park during fashionable hours, creating spectacle that delighted gossips, whilst gradually silencing malicious rumors through consistent demonstration of genuine affection. Lord Alexander introduced Genevieve to his younger brother James, recently returned from India, and to Miss Diana Fairfax, whose betrothal to James was formally announced to general celebration. The 4 of them formed unexpected friendship, with Diana proving far more intelligent than her conventional prettiness suggested. She confided to Genevieve that she had feared marrying James would mean becoming mere ornament, and was grateful to observe that Lord Alexander's courtship of Genevieve suggested the Beaumont brothers valued substance alongside beauty. The Duke of Greystone himself called at Berkeley Square, a gesture of such significance that the Viscountess barely contained her triumph. His Grace spoke with Genevieve privately, expressing satisfaction at his son's choice, and acknowledging with surprising candor that he had worried Alexander might never find woman who could engage both his mind and his heart. Lady Genevieve appeared to accomplish both, which boded well for his heir's future happiness. As summer approached and the season drew toward conclusion, Lord Alexander invited Genevieve and the Viscountess to visit his Northumberland estate. Such invitation constituted clear signal of serious matrimonial intent, and Genevieve accepted with mixture of anticipation and remaining uncertainty. The journey north took 3 days by comfortable carriage, passing through countryside transformed by summer's full arrival. The estate itself exceeded Genevieve's imaginings. Ancient house built of grey stone, surrounded by parkland that stretched toward wild moorland beyond. Gardens spread in careful cultivation near the house, whilst forest and stream promised exploration for those brave enough to venture. Lord Alexander showed her the estate with obvious pride. Tenant farms where families had lived for generations, villages where his family's patronage had built schools and churches, landscapes that spoke of centuries of careful stewardship. He introduced her to his land agent, his steward, his housekeeper, presenting her not as mere visitor, but as someone whose opinion mattered, whose judgments would be valued. Most significantly, he showed her his library, a magnificent room filled with thousands of volumes collected over generations. Here were the philosophy texts they had discussed, the scientific works she longed to study, and space enough to pursue any intellectual interest she might develop. He told her quietly that this room would be hers as much as his, that he hoped they might spend many hours here together, reading and discussing and challenging one another's thinking. That evening, After supper in the ancient dining hall beneath portraits of Beaumont ancestors stretching back centuries, Lord Alexander asked Genevieve to walk with him in the gardens. Summer twilight lingered long at this northern latitude, and roses bloomed with profusion that perfumed the air. They walked in silence initially, following paths between flowering borders toward more distant sections where wilderness began reclaiming cultivation. Near a small folly overlooking the parkland, Lord Alexander stopped and turned to face her. He spoke of his hopes for their future, partnership built on mutual respect, marriage that would expand rather than constrain her possibilities, life together that would honor both duty and affection. He had spent 3 months proving through consistent behavior that his words matched his intentions. He had introduced her to his family, his estate, his life's work. He had demonstrated that he valued her counsel, respected her intelligence, and desired her partnership above mere decorative companionship. Now he asked formally what he had asked informally months before. Would Lady Genevieve Sinclair consent to become his wife, to share his life and responsibilities, to build together something that might transcend the limitations both law and society imposed? Genevieve looked out across the parkland, watching evening mist rise from distant streams while she composed her response. 3 months prior, she would have refused immediately, would have maintained that principles mattered more than personal happiness. Yet 3 months of Lord Alexander's patient courtship had taught her that principles existed to serve human flourishing rather than prevent it. She had been fighting against the wrong enemy. Marriage itself was not the prison she feared. Loveless marriage was the prison, marriage without respect or partnership or genuine affection. What Lord Alexander offered was something entirely different. Union between equals who chose one another freely despite legal structures neither could control. She turned to him and spoke with clarity, born of long consideration. She accepted his proposal not as surrender of principles, but as their ultimate expression. She chose marriage freely, chose partnership over isolation, chose to trust that love could exist within imperfect institutions when both parties committed to making it so. Lord Alexander's joy manifested in embrace that would have scandalized observers had any been present to witness. He held her with tenderness that belied his strength, and when he kissed her, not as courtesy or duty, but with an urgency that stole her breath and silenced every argument of reason. Genevieve discovered that philosophy had prepared her for many things, but not for the overwhelming heat of the truth of her own desire. They returned to the house engaged, formally and irrevocably. The Viscountess wept with happiness when informed, whilst the Duke expressed measured satisfaction appropriate to his rank. Letters were dispatched to London announcing the betrothal, and preparations began for wedding that would unite two families of considerable consequence. The marriage took place 8 weeks later in the estate's ancient chapel, with family and intimate friends in attendance. Genevieve wore ivory silk rather than pure white, a subtle acknowledgement that she came to marriage as thinking person rather than blank slate awaiting masculine inscription. Lord Alexander, she must learn to think of him as simply Alexander now, stood beside her with expressions suggesting he understood this distinction and loved her more for making it. The ceremony itself followed traditional Anglican rites, with their familiar promises of love and honor. When the rector pronounced them man and wife, Genevieve felt not the dread she had always anticipated, but rather profound peace. She had not surrendered herself in this marriage, she had chosen partnership, and that choice made all the difference. The wedding breakfast concluded with toasts and celebration, after which the newly married couple departed for brief honeymoon at a smaller property Alexander maintained near the Scottish border. Here, away from family and social obligation, they began learning to be husband and wife in practice rather than merely theory. Alexander proved true to every promise he had made. He consulted her about estate matters, valued her opinions on agricultural improvements, encouraged her to establish a school for tenant children where girls might receive education equal to boys. When they disagreed, which they did frequently, both being possessed of strong opinions and sharper intellects, they argued with passion but without domination, each respecting the other's reasoning, even when unconvinced. Most surprisingly to Genevieve, marriage's physical intimacy proved revelation rather than trial. Alexander approached their wedding night with patience and tenderness, ensuring her comfort before his own pleasure, treating her body with same respect he accorded her mind. She discovered that physical union between equals could be source of joy rather than merely duty, that desire and intellect need not be opposing forces. The months following their marriage established patterns that would define their life together. They divided their time between London during the season and Northumberland during summer and autumn. In London, Genevieve discovered that being Lady Alexander Beaumont, for Alexander held the courtesy title of Marquess from his father's dukedom, granted her influence she had never possessed as unmarried daughter. She used this position to support charitable endeavors focused on women's education and welfare, working alongside other ladies of rank to accomplish what individual effort could never achieve. In Northumberland, she threw herself into estate management alongside her husband. She established the Promise School, taught there herself when qualified teachers could not be found, and discovered satisfaction in practical application of principles she had previously held only theoretically. The Tennant families regarded her with initial suspicion that gradually transformed into respect as she proved herself genuinely interested in their welfare rather than merely performing noble duty. A year after their marriage, Genevieve discovered herself with child. The pregnancy brought unexpected emotions, joy at creating new life with Alexander, but also fear about losing herself in motherhood as so many women did. Alexander reassured her repeatedly that bearing his child did not mean abandoning her own interests and pursuits, that they would ensure she retained identity beyond maternal role. Their daughter was born on a spring morning that promised renewal. They named her Eleanor, after Genevieve's grandmother, who by all accounts had been similarly independent-minded. Holding her infant daughter, Genevieve understood with new clarity why women throughout history had accepted marriage despite its injustices. Because love, for husband, for children, for family, created bonds that transcended legal definitions. Yet she also understood that her ability to maintain self within marriage depended entirely upon Alexander's willing partnership. Had she married differently, to gentlemen who expected subordination rather than collaboration, her fate would have been far different. This knowledge strengthened rather than diminished her conviction that marriage law required reform, that women should not depend upon masculine benevolence for basic dignity and autonomy. 2 years into their marriage, Alexander's father died peacefully in his sleep, making Alexander the Duke of Greystone and Genevieve his Duchess. The elevation brought increased responsibility, but also increased influence. As Duchess, Genevieve wielded social power that she employed deliberately toward advancing women's welfare and education. She hosted salons where intellectual women might gather, supported publication of works by female authors, and used her position to advocate for legal reforms that might grant married women greater autonomy. Alexander supported these endeavors without reservation. He had meant what he said about partnership, and he demonstrated this commitment daily through actions that matched his words. When other peers questioned why he permitted his Duchess such unusual freedom, he responded simply that he had married her for her mind and would be fool indeed to waste such resource. 5 years into their marriage, Genevieve reflected upon how thoroughly her life had diverged from the path she once imagined. She had sworn never to marry, believing matrimony incompatible with intellectual life and personal autonomy. Yet here she was, Duchess, mother, wife, and still fundamentally herself. She had not been diminished by marriage, but rather enlarged, given scope for action and influence she could never have achieved alone. Most remarkably, she had discovered that love need not mean loss of self. Alexander loved her not despite her intelligence and independence, but because of these qualities. He had chosen partner rather than possession, had sought equal rather than subordinate. And in choosing freely to bind herself to someone who valued her completely, she had found freedom of different sort than she once imagined necessary. She wrote these reflections in journals she maintained, adding them to years of observations about love, marriage, law, and society. Perhaps someday, these writings might contribute to larger conversations about women's position, might help other intelligent women navigate between principle and possibility. For now, it sufficed that she had found her own path through that difficult territory. On an autumn evening in their 6th year of marriage, Genevieve stood in the library at their Northumberland estate, their daughter Eleanor playing nearby with wooden blocks whilst their infant son, named William for Alexander's late father, slept in his cradle. Alexander sat at the desk working through correspondence, occasionally reading amusing passages aloud for her commentary. Watching them, Genevieve felt contentment she once would have scorned as impossible. She had not abandoned her principles in marrying. She had discovered that principles could be lived within imperfect institutions when commitment to partnership transcended mere legal form. Marriage remained in many ways an unjust system that subordinated women's autonomy to masculine authority. Yet within that flawed structure, two people of goodwill could create something approaching equality through mutual respect and genuine affection. She had been wrong, she acknowledged privately, in believing love and principle incompatible. The error had lain not in her analysis of marriage's legal injustices, but in assuming those injustices must define every individual union. Alexander had taught her that human relationships could exceed the boundaries law imposed upon them, that two people committed to partnership could create marriage very different from what society or statute prescribed. Most importantly, she had learned that happiness need not mean betraying one's convictions. She remained committed to advocating for legal reforms that would grant married women greater autonomy. She continued supporting women's education and welfare through every means available. She raised her daughter to value learning alongside accomplishment, to understand that femininity need not mean intellectual passivity. And she did all this not despite being wife and mother, but while being wife and mother to someone who valued and supported these endeavors. As evening deepened and Alexander lit additional candles against the gathering darkness, Genevieve moved to stand beside his chair. He looked up, smiling with affection undimmed by years of marriage. She touched his shoulder gently, this man who had challenged every assumption she held about masculine nature and matrimonial possibility. She had never wanted marriage until a stranger in a library made her question everything. Now, 6 years wed and profoundly happy, she understood that she had not been questioning marriage itself, but rather her own capacity to trust. Alexander had proved himself worthy of that trust repeatedly, and in trusting him, she had discovered not imprisonment, but partnership, not subordination, but equality of hearts, if not of law. Outside, autumn rain began falling gently against the library windows, bringing with it the promise of winter's approach and spring's eventual return. Inside, surrounded by books and family, Genevieve Sinclair Beaumont, Duchess of Greystone, formerly London's most notorious bluestocking, felt gratitude for the path her life had taken, unexpected, unconventional, and completely her own. And so another tale of hearts united reaches its blessed conclusion. Love, it seems, finds a way even through the strictest conventions of proper society, and even through the firmest philosophical objections of those who believe themselves immune to its influence. The institution of marriage remains imperfect, burdened by laws that grant men authority over women's very existence. Yet within that flawed structure, two people of good faith and genuine affection may create something approaching perfection. Partnership built on respect, union founded on equality of spirit, if not of statute, and love that honors rather than diminishes the beloved. Lady Genevieve discovered what many before her have learned, and many after will learn again, that the heart has reasons reason knows not of, and that sometimes the greatest courage lies not in maintaining principle against all cost, but in trusting another human being enough to risk happiness despite imperfect circumstances. In this, As in all matters of the heart, may we each find such fortune.